Okay. It seems like a good place to start. It looks like we've got a good turnout already. Um, so thank you everybody for joining us this morning. My name is Andrew Perry. I'm the Director of Fiscal Research at the Fiscal Policy Institute. And today we're going to cover what happened in education and childcare policy in the fiscal year 2026 enacted budget. Um, Everyone can see my screen, right? Yeah. So on the agenda today, we're going to cover foundation aid. We're going to cover other public school funding other than foundation aid. We're going to go through the Child Care Assistance Program, which is the state's child care subsidy program, and then finally the child tax credit and public and funding for public higher education. Um, the bulk of the weight is going to be where we start, which is foundation aid. I'll note that I think people can leave questions in the chat function, and I'm going to leave. I think I left us an hour. My presentation is going to be much shorter than that, and so we're going to really leave ample time for questions and discussion at the end. Okay, so with that, let's start and find out what happened in foundation aid in the enacted budget. So first, we'll give a little bit of background. Foundation aid is, of course, the main way that public schools are funded in New York State. The foundation aid formula allocates about $26 billion to public school districts across the state every year. And it's been the subject of pretty intense debate over the last year. So as part of her executive budget last year in fiscal year 2025, the governor proposed a couple of technical changes to the foundation aid formula that would have restrained foundation aid funding. So it would have really reined in the growth from year to year in school aid. So the effect of that for in fiscal year 2025 would have been a little bit more than $400 million of reined in school aid growth. These proposals were rejected by the legislature. And instead, the enacted budget funded a study of the formula. That study was undertaken by the Rockefeller Institute at SUNY Albany. Their report was published in December of last year. And this year's executive budget, fiscal year 2026, the governor selected 3 of those studies proposals for inclusion in the executive budget. What's really important about her selection of just 3 of the dozens of proposals that were made in that report is that they seem to be selected to really not change the overall level of foundation aid school funding. The overall level of school funding was sort of strikingly on par with where it would have been without any changes to the formula. But it pretty substantially affected the distribution of funding across school districts. Most importantly, from New York City, which stood to lose out on a couple $100 million of foundation aid funding, and then the gains were offset pretty broadly by districts across the rest of the state. So before we get to the actual numbers of how these proposals shake out for the city and for districts across the state, let's talk about the actual formula components. So the first 4 items in this row were proposed by the executive, and then the last 2 were the major proposals that were put forward by the legislature and included in some form in the enacted budget. The poverty measure and measure of economic disadvantage are 2 ways that the formula looks at districts' economic needs, and it spits out something called the pupil needs index. So districts that have higher pupil needs indices get relatively more foundation aid funding, and then conversely, districts with lower pupil needs indices, of course, are allocated a little bit less foundation aid funding. The executive budget proposed sort of overhauling the pupil needs index. First, it proposed updating the poverty measure, which currently uses poverty estimates from the year 2000, from the 2000 decennial census, and replacing that with an average of poverty estimates over the last 3 years, over the 3 most recent years produced by the Census Bureau. And second, the governor proposed replacing the measure of economic disadvantage from the current use of free school meal eligibility to a broader measure that looks at the number of students who receive public assistance and a fairly broad range of sort of public supports. And that gets at a little bit more holistic view of sort of the number of students who have some economic need or economic disadvantage. Both of these two measures of economic need are weighted equally in the formula, so they're equally important to each other. They were both accepted by the legislature in the legislative one-house budgets, and they were both enacted into the final budget. So these two formula elements have been updated. Third, the executive budget proposed increasing the maximum state share of foundation aid. So to understand what this does, it's helpful to explain in really simple terms what the foundation aid formula does. The primary thing the foundation aid formula does is it estimates the total amount of spending that's necessary for a district to provide a sound basic education, which is guaranteed by the state's constitution. And then the second thing the formula does is it says, okay, of that amount that's necessary to deliver a sound basic education, how much should the state pay and how much should the local government pay? So that first part is really where the formula looks at local needs, economic needs, and local costs. And then that second part, how much should the state pay versus the localities, looks at districts' resources. So it looks at districts' average incomes and average property values. And it arrives at a share that the state will pay. Currently, that state share is capped at 91%. So that affects really the lowest wealth districts in the state. So for the lowest wealth districts in the state will pay as much as 91% of your foundation aid costs, and your local district is responsible for coming up with that remaining 9%. And the executive budget proposed increasing that maximum share to 93%. So again, that really benefits just the districts that really are in sort of the bottom 10th of all districts in the state in terms of local resources, in terms of their wealth and income. And that proposal is also accepted by the legislature and enacted. Finally, the executive proposed guaranteeing a minimum increase of 2%. This is not a change to the foundation aid formula because it's really just affects funding for school year 2026. But this says that if the foundation aid formula, again, just for school year 2026, would spit out flat funding or a really small increase, the state will give you at least a 2% bump. So that really only affects a small number of districts that have, pretty steady enrollment or maybe even declining enrollment, and it gives them a little bit of an increase. The legislature proposed a slightly larger minimum increase, but the executive proposal of a 2% guaranteed minimum was enacted. So those are the executive proposals. They were all accepted. And then the final budget negotiation debate really centered around two big pieces of the foundation aid formula. First is the weight given to English language learners. So English language learners, obviously there's special instruction that's a little bit more costly. And so the current formula gives these pupils a 50% weight, meaning they get 50% more funding than what the formula would otherwise determine is the per pupil amount of funding that is necessary for that district. The assembly proposed increasing the ELL weight to 65%. So that would really benefit districts that have a lot of ELL pupils and give them and allocate more resources to those districts. The enacted budget was sort of a compromise, but it increases the ELL weight to 53%. So it's really just gives, it really just enacts 1/5 of the assembly's proposed increase there. So while it will channel some additional funding to districts that have a lot of ELL students, the effect is actually fairly modest because it's just a 3 percentage point bump. So this is not going to be a big driver of change for most districts. The really big driver of change is the regional cost index. So the regional cost index looks at average wages in broad regions of the state. So the state is lumped into 9 regions. Districts are given more funding if if they're in a region that has higher wages, because higher wage regions tend to have higher costs. So it just costs more for teachers to be able to live in those districts. Um, like the poverty measure, the RCI is really stuck in the past in the current formula. It currently relies on data from when the formula was adopted. And so the data for the RCI is from 2006, and it does not update under the formula. So it's really just stuck at that past level. Um, but over the last 20 years, the economic disparities between regions in New York State have really grown, right? So the wages and cost of living in New York City has grown a lot faster than wages and the cost of living in many parts of upstate New York. So that greater regional disparity really kind of hinders and sets back districts, especially New York City, and some downstate regions. The legislature, both houses of the legislature proposed updating it, but they proposed quite different updates from each other. What's important is that both sets of updates would have benefited New York City and uh, Westchester. And why are we talking about Westchester? The treatment of downstate under the RCI is this kind of odd quirk in the formula where most of the 9 regional groupings used by the RCI just follow the economic development regions that are used in sort of many parts of state policy. But Long Island is lumped in with New York City, so they share a region. What this does is it advantages Long Island because Long Island gets to be averaged in with relatively higher cost, higher wage New York City. It's a slight disadvantage to New York City because they're averaged in with lower wage Long Island. And then Westchester, which also has pretty high costs and pretty high wages, is just grouped with its Hudson Valley region, which goes all the way up to Poughkeepsie, where wages and the cost of living is much lower. So it's a pretty big disadvantage for Westchester. It's a disadvantage for New York City, and it's a big advantage for Long Island. So a lot of the changes in the regional cost index really sort of center around how it will affect New York City and its suburbs. The legislature would have given a bump to Hudson Valley and New York City. And what was enacted was only a bump for Westchester, not even the whole Hudson Valley region. They just kind of carved out Westchester County, gave it an increased regional cost index, and left everything else the same. So how does this net out? As I mentioned, the executive proposals were sort of had strikingly little effect on the overall funding level. So the executive proposals would have increased foundation aid by $25 million. It's worth noting that the changes here are for school year 2026 relative to school year 2026 funding if no changes were enacted. So this is not year over year. This is changes relative to if they just left the formula alone and didn't change it. So $25 million relative to a $26 billion program is really a negligible change. The major effect of the executive proposal would be lowering New York City's allocation by about $350 million, and that would have been offset by increasing it by the same amount pretty broadly in the rest of the state. And we're going to come to how broadly it was in just a minute. The Senate and Assembly would have brought New York City back to where it was. So while the Senate and Assembly both add about $300 million relative to the executive, again, it's important to note that they kind of bring it back to where New York City would be if no changes were adopted at all. But they do add $550 to $600 million because they kind of preserve or even extend some of the increases that would be seen in the rest of the state. The version that was enacted, unsurprisingly, looks a lot more like the executive than the legislative proposals. Foundation aid does end up with a bit more funding. It ends up with about $140 million more funding than it would had these changes not been adopted. But New York City is still way behind. New York City is still about $320 million below where it would have been without these changes. Again, that difference between the executive and enacted compared to the legislative, really overwhelmingly driven by this debate around the regional cost index, and leaving it at that level that's stuck in the past continues to be a pretty big disadvantage for the city. Beyond the city, the other large cities here are the sort of their New York State education law uses the big five as an important category. Those are the other four largest cities. They all see, fairly modest but real gains under all proposals, including the enacted. But really, the gains are shared pretty broadly across the smaller districts of the state. And here I show where how those gains sort of parcel out by wealth decile. So I group districts into wealth groups where 1 is the lowest wealth district and 10 is the highest wealth. What's interesting is that while on the face of it, the changes made to the formula might kind of seem progressive, right? It seems like they might be channeling more funding to the lowest wealth schools. While that is the case to an extent, where the first decile, which is the poorest schools, do see the biggest increase, there's really not a clear progressive pattern beyond that effect. The gains are really pretty broadly based um, across the wealth distribution in this state. And the reason is that while the changes are updating the measures of poverty and economic disadvantage, they're not really channeling more money, more new funds just to they're not really targeting poverty. They're sort of just updating how we're measuring it. And so there's going to be a lot of idiosyncrasy in the data that really makes it sort of broad-based, and there's not a very clear progressive pattern in the enacted changes to foundation aid. As we can see, once again, the really dominant effect is just on New York City and lowering its allocation. Okay, I'm going to quickly cover other public school funding. So school aid in New York City, 26 billion of it is foundation aid, and then another 10 billion are channeled by other other school aid formulas, most of which are expense based. So this is the state reimbursing districts for allowable expenses. Before we get to that, an executive proposal that got a lot of attention was doing universal school meals. Currently, about 80% or a bit more than 80% of public school students are in schools that offer free school meals already. And the executive proposed adding $160 million to that to close that gap and make sure everybody could get free school meals. This is a popular proposal, and it was enacted. During budget negotiations, the budget changed 2 other formula-based school aids, charter school transitional aid and career education aid. These changes collectively add $100 million to other school aid. Again, that's compared to that's against $10 billion that these formulas allocate all collectively. So that's a pretty sizable increase. And these gains, unlike foundation aid, are pretty proportionally distributed, where New York City gets $42 million of this, which is in proportion to its share of the state population and of school aid overall. So that's other school aid. And then finally, I want to mention universal pre-K. So universal pre-K in New York State is really far short of actually being universal. UPK in New York City is universal for 4-year-olds, and the city's getting pretty close to getting its 3K program right and providing universal coverage to 3-year-olds. Outside of New York City, only 60% of 4-year-olds are in districts that offer UPK, and almost no 3-year-olds. 3K is extremely uncommon outside of New York City. So we're really far short of the actual U part of UPK in the rest of the state. The executive budget did not propose any action on this front. They wanted to hold funding flat at 1.2 billion. So the programs that are already funded would consider receiving the same amount of funding, but we would not let any new programs in, and sort of continue to have a UPK system that's not universal. The legislature proposed some progress on UPK. So the Senate and Assembly both proposed raising the minimum per pupil grants. So the current per pupil grant under the UPK program is $5,400 per student. That's going to be allocated to sort of the districts that are newly added that have relatively high wealth, are going to get that lowest amount. And in high-cost districts, 5,400 is really not enough to support a UPK seat. And so a lot of districts that might even be eligible for it just aren't starting UPK programs because the funding isn't sufficient for them to support UPK programs. And outside of New York City, most local districts don't have much spare fiscal capacity to add their own funding the way New York City does, their own local funding. The Senate and Assembly both wanted to increase that minimum per pupil grant. The Senate wanted to increase it by $6,700 or to $6,700, and the Assembly wanted to increase it to $10,000 per pupil. And these would have added $150 million and $300 million respectively. That would have been to programs that are already part of the UPK program. It just would have made those programs a little bit more viable in the minimum grant states and given some extra resources to those programs. It wouldn't have actually expanded it to new districts that don't already have UPK programs. Only the Senate proposed an actual new expansion grant that would have started to pull new programs into UPK. And they would have pulled new programs into UPK with that $10,000 per pupil grant, which should be enough to really start to make it viable in some of these higher cost districts that don't currently have UPK programs. These proposals were not included in the enacted budget. So the enacted budget maintained the status quo UPK funding, no new investments there. Because there's such a clear need, I just wanted to highlight this as an area where there's really still a pretty clear need for new investment and policy action. And then, with UPK, it's important to note that once you get to 4-year-olds, but especially once you get down to 3-year-olds, this intersects in a really significant way with the state's childcare system, right? I mean, funding for 3-year-olds to be enrolled in a free program really is functioning as childcare, and that segues us into our discussion of the shortfalls facing the state's childcare program. So the state has a program called the Childcare Assistance Program, which provides childcare subsidies in the form of vouchers to low and moderate income families. It provides vouchers that let them pay for daycare. In recent years, this has been a real area of policy success where the legislature has had a lot of success pushing to expand this program. The two most significant expansions were raising the income eligibility for families to be able to enroll in this, all the way up to 85% of the state median income. And this nearly doubled the population of children in the state who are eligible for the program. It doubled it from about a quarter to nearly half of children in the state are eligible under these new income eligibility thresholds. And then the state also increased the cost, the value of vouchers. They raised the voucher value to make sure that once families do get vouchers, those vouchers really are sort of sufficient to actually pay for childcare, which has obviously become increasingly expensive throughout the state. The increase to expansions really drove enrollment up in recent years, and the state has begun to pretty severely underestimate the costs. So the state, even though they've enacted it, the state really has begun to not allocate enough money to cover all the people who are now eligible under the program. And what this has done is it's forced districts across the state to put families who are eligible under the income criteria onto wait lists, so denying them coverage. This is a statewide problem, but it's especially severe in New York City. So about 1/3 of the way through the fiscal year, New York City had already used half of its allocation from the state. So New York City is spending its state allocation way faster than the state had planned, which prompted the state last month to start a wait list and start putting income eligible families on a wait list. Obviously, this is a huge problem for the actual families who are denied coverage. Some estimates say that the number of children who are denied coverage could be anywhere from 30,000 children to 60,000 children if this problem wasn't solved. And then it also represents a real setback for these policy victories to expand the CCAP program. There's pretty it was pretty broad support for improving these programs. But if the state isn't funding the actual cost of enrolling kids who they've made eligible, it's as if those victories never happened. And that's what you see when you move to wait lists. The executive budget did not address this problem. It instead proposed holding appropriations for CCAP flat at just below $1 billion of state funds and about $760 of federal funds. And those allocations would have been held flat between fiscal year 2025 and 2026. In fairness to the executive budget, the true scale of this problem really only started to become clear as budget negotiations started to grind on. So during the budget negotiation season, New York City requested $1.1 billion for fiscal year 2025 and 2026. So sort of their 2-year need to fully support all of the families who are eligible and who they believe are going to apply in the next 18 months and not have to resort to wait lists. Advocacy groups were a bit more cautious, calling for $500 million. In its one-house budget, the Assembly proposed adding $213 million to CCAP. For our part, FPI put forward that if you took the New York City claims at face value, but made all of the funding available immediately rather than waiting until October, which is the normal funding cycle for CCAP funds, we think that $700 million might have been sufficient. It just might mean that we're going to come back in next year's state budget and have to reassess and possibly add additional funding on top of that. Because enrollment continues to rise, especially in the city, the real funding level is sort of a moving target. So our analysis said that maybe $700 million would be sufficient, but we might have to come back, see where enrollment is in 10 months, and make a new decision about where the sort of steady state funding need really is. The enacted budget got us pretty close to that $700 billion mark. It collectively adds $675 million in resources. Of this, $400 million is in state funds, of which $350 million is going to be earmarked for the city, and the remaining $50 million is going to be for districts outside of the city. And then it also shifts costs onto New York City. So under the current program, all districts have a maintenance of effort, which is their sort of required contribution of local funds to be eligible for state funds. New York City's maintenance of effort is $50 million. And the enacted budget raises New York City's required share to $328 million. So the city is going to be responsible for coming up with an additional $275 million as part of the budget that it enacts in June. It's going to enact a budget next year. They're going to have to come up with this amount of money to be eligible for that state funding. So it does shift quite a lot of money onto New York, or quite a lot of funding demands onto New York City. But taken together, the nearly $700 million is likely the minimal amount necessary to avoid having to continue to rely on wait lists, and it should be enough to get each district over the line to next year, at which point we're going to have to do another evaluation of where enrollment has ended up and see what the real needs are. Okay. I'm going to go through these last two pieces relatively quickly so that we can get onto question and answer. The child tax credit was one of the major proposals put forward by the governor in her executive budget. Here I'm showing that dark purple line is the state's current child tax credit, which is known as the Empire State Child Credit. And then these two lines, the lighter blue and solid blue line, represent the allocations for 0 to 3-year-olds and 4 to 17-year-olds under the governor's proposal. There are really 3 major changes that are made. First is raising the maximum benefit per child from $330 to $1,000 for children under 4 and to $500 for 4 to 17-year-olds. Second, the executive proposal wanted to eliminate the phase-in for very low-income families. So you can see on the left-hand side of the chart, the current state child tax credit follows the federal program by phasing in for extremely low-income households, meaning that people who make $0 or extremely low amounts of money are not eligible for any credit. And the executive budget proposed eliminating that. And then finally, the executive budget proposed lowering the phase out rate for higher income families. So you can see on the right-hand side of the chart, the current structure phases out very rapidly once you get to 110,000. This is for married joint filers, by the way. And the executive proposal wanted to lower that phase out rate so that the credit's going to go sort of further up the income distribution and reach more upper middle income families. That proposal was enacted, but I wanted to call attention to the legislature's proposal. Both houses proposed phasing in the working families tax credit, which provides a more generous $1,600 maximum credit. It also provides a $100 credit per child to all taxpayers, regardless of income. And what's really important and what I really want to call attention to is that the working families tax credit would be phased in over 5 years, but then it would be permanent. Whereas the executive version that was enacted is temporary. It's going to phase in over 1 year in 2025 and then only be in full effect for 2 years, for 2026 and 2027, after which it's going to expire. So it means we're going to come back in 2 years and either renegotiate this, or middle income or lower and middle income families with children are going to see a big cut in their benefits. So this is going to be a sort of a live issue in child policy in the future. And then last, I want to touch pretty quickly on public higher education. The state provides operating assistance to the SUNY and CUNY systems. SUNY in the executive budget received a pretty modest 3.3% proposed increase, and importantly, all of this increase goes to university-wide programs and central administration, meaning that it's funding that's controlled by the SUNY central staff in Albany and the governor, and it does not go directly to campuses. That's important because campuses across the SUNY system are facing operating deficits that are leading many of them to cut program offerings and begin to downsize. And so the executive budget really didn't propose that. It proposed some special programs that would be managed centrally, but did not increase the allocation for campus that goes directly to campuses. And that program was largely adopted. The small amount of money that was added in budget negotiations also went to university-wide programs. CUNY came out a little bit better. The executive budget proposed a 4.8% increase to the CUNY system, most of which is going to the CUNY funds operating costs for CUNY senior colleges. And about $45 million was added in budget negotiations. And this money covers in large part the cost of collective bargaining on those senior colleges. So all in all, an actually fairly solid budget for CUNY and pretty status quo or disappointing budget for the SUNY system. And then lastly, I want to note that these appropriations include $35 million for a program that funds free tuition to community colleges for adults. So people who want to go back to community colleges to get a degree in a list of specified programs are now eligible for free tuition. Obviously, a $35 appropriation level is very modest in the grand scheme of college funding, but we think it sort of points in a promising direction towards tuition-free public higher education. And so it's a program that's sort of worth keeping an eye on and worth looking for ways to expand in that direction. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Okay, no one has asked any questions in the chat, so I think if people have questions, you can also just raise your hand or you can put them in the chat and we'll see them there.
Stop sharing so I can see the chat.
In the chat, Robert Goldsmith asks about funding for disabled children.
That is a good question. There is special needs about or that's provided in or that's part of the foundation aid formula that is, I think, not touched um, by the changes this year. Could I explain a bit more about the regional price setting process? So here, yeah, I think here's the regional cost index. Um, Happy to talk more about that. That index is based on, again, it's data from 2006. It's average wages that are for professions. It's supposed to be for professions that are comparable to teachers, but not including teachers. So it's like teachers' economic peers. What are their average wages? Um, and then the RCI sort of indexes regions against each other. So the lowest wage regions get an RCI of 1, which means that they get no funding bump out of that part of the formula. And the highest RCI is New York City, which has an RCI of, I think, 1.42, which means wages for sort of teacher comparable professions are 42% higher than they are in the lowest district. And so it increases New York's foundation aid allocation by 42%. So that's how the RCI works sort of at a high level. I hope that's helpful. Okay, well, if we're not having any other questions, I can let everybody go a little early. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.